So I have a spooky story for you, and this one takes us to California. Now, our story begins in a classroom on test day. There's a teacher named Miss Veronica, and she's got a class full of high schoolers, we'll say about 17 to 18 years old. And one of the questions that she had on the test was a short essay about what they want to do with their lives. Now, as she's sitting there waiting for the class to end and the test to be submitted, she starts grading the exams, and she's noticing as she's going through them that a lot of the students have not answered this question. They've either left it blank, drawn a picture, or just put something absurd down. And this really disappoints her because Veronica has wanted her entire life to be a teacher, and she thought she was doing a pretty good job at it. This was one of those teachers who took pride in her workmanship. She's somebody who made sure to learn all of her students' names on the first day, figured out their learning styles, made sure they had whatever they needed, and really went above and beyond to be the kind of teacher that inspired her when she was younger. And yet, as the students continued to turn these exams in, she started to get more and more dejected, wondering if maybe she was the problem and maybe she wasn't inspiring them enough to want to think forward and about their futures. So once time ran out on the exams, Veronica collected all of the tests that were left, and in frustration, she asked them why so many of them left one of the questions blank. And that question was, what do you want to be when you grow up or graduate from high school? Now, this should have been a give me question. That's why she put it on the exam. She thought it would be thought-provoking and inspiring and would lead the students to want to think about what happens after they graduate from high school. But as she opened the floor for questions, the responses the students gave her back as to why they didn't answer the questions were disheartening. The biggest response amongst the students who refused to answer that question was, they didn't see themselves having a future. In fact, a lot of them didn't see themselves making 20 years old. And that's because the area in which Veronica was teaching was an extremely disenfranchised area. There was a lot of gang violence, a lot of poverty. There were just a lot of issues happening outside of the school that impacted these students' lives and made them think that tomorrow wasn't promised, let alone graduating high school. So once the class ended, it was just Veronica alone in the classroom. She sat down to grade the remainder of the test, and as she continued to pore over the exams that she had gotten, she looked up and noticed that there was one student left. Now, as she studied this student, she realized that she couldn't recognize him, and this was odd because, again, Veronica is one of those teachers that remembers everybody. Now, not wanting to be rude, Vanessa accepted the student's paperwork, but before he left, she chided him and said that he was late turning in the exam. He happily smiled at her, though, nodded his head, and then left the classroom. Now, as she was looking down at his paper, she recognized the name, which said Rudy Hernandez. Now, racking her brain, she realized that she had never seen a Rudy Hernandez on her roster, and so she went out into the hallway to chase the student down just to ask him if he was in the right class. But when she looked outside of the door, there was nobody there. So Vanessa returned to her classroom, sat back down at her desk, and continued to read the exams, but she decided to start with the one that was already in her hand, the one belonging to Rudy Hernandez. Now, as she sat down to read the paper, the first thing she noticed was his mastery of words, his use of sentence structure to convey a message that inspired even her. In the short essay that sat in front of her, Rudy expressed how he wanted to be a teacher when he grew up. He talked about how teachers connect with their students, how they inspire them, how they demonstrate items that are otherwise hard to teach, and how they make a difference in the world overall. Now, the ending of the essay is what really sent a smile across Veronica's face. At the end, Rudy put down that he wanted to model himself after Veronica, and that was something that just made her pause and reflect. But as she took a break from reading, she looked up and she noticed that the student that was in the classroom earlier was back again, Rudy Hernandez. Now, the strange thing is, as she looked at him, she realized that she had never heard him walk back in the classroom, and she would have because when she came back in from going out in the hallway, she closed the door. And yet, as she looked down the row of desks, Rudy was standing right at the back of the classroom where she had first seen him earlier that day. So briefly alarmed at the unexpected presence, she asked Rudy if he needed anything. Yet Rudy didn't answer her and just slowly started to creep towards the front of the classroom where her desk was positioned. So she asked him another question. Is there anything I can do to help you? And Rudy, again, didn't respond. She asked him about his exam and how he learned to write like that. She was impressed with it. And yet, for every question she asked, Rudy had no answer, yet he continued to move even closer to her. And this is when she started to get very uncomfortable because Rudy's face, which was previously warm, had started to grow cold and steely. And he, of course, continued to move ever slowly towards her. And of course, by the time he approached the opposite side of her desk, staring at her from about a foot away, Veronica who was beyond uncomfortable at this point, got startled, pushed her chair back away from the desk that she was sitting at, and moved towards the blackboard that was behind her. And as this happened, bullets littered the classroom, a barrage of them, just all over the place. They hit the globe that was on her desk. They hit the chair that she had been sitting in. They hit the chalkboard that was right behind her. The entire event, terrifying and unexpected, elicited a scream from her. And as the ordeal ended, she looked up to find Rudy still standing there. Now, the first thing that came to her mind was that had Rudy not moved closer to her, she surely would have been hit by the bullet that went through the back of her chair. That was meant for her. And so as she looked up at the boy who was still standing on the opposite side of her desk, she took notice of his face and realized that the warmness that was there previously had yet again returned. She noticed that the warmness that was there in his expression earlier had yet again returned. And seeing this, she had the impression that seeing the expression on his face, she got the impression that whatever he did was intentional. Now, still shocked, she took her eyes away from the student briefly just to survey the classroom, and when she went to return them to his face, he was nowhere to be seen. Now, at this point, the ruckus had attracted a small crowd of teachers. They rushed into the room to see what was going on and to make sure that Veronica was okay. And when they entered the classroom, the ordeal was shocking. Bullet holes had littered the entire classroom, for which at least one of them was meant for her. And yet, there she stood unscathed. Now, the principal, who was one of the people who came in to see Veronica, asked her if she was okay, quickly surveyed the damage, and then went back to Veronica. And of course, Veronica, still shaken, said that luckily she was okay, and it was all thanks to a student named Rudy. Now, the principal and one of the other teachers looked at each other as she was saying this, and they were like, "Who's Rudy? We don't have a Rudy." And she was like, "Rudy Hernandez." As she said this, one of the other teachers cut her off and said that couldn't be. And of course, Veronica, having stood there and witnessed Rudy Hernandez in her classroom, insisted, yes, it was Rudy Hernandez. At that point, the other teacher and the principal looked at each other, and then they looked at Veronica, and they let her know that it's impossible for Rudy Hernandez to have been in the classroom that day because Rudy Hernandez had died years ago. Now, hearing this, Veronica had a rush of emotions wash over her. She was confused, inconsolable, scared, because she had just seen all of these things happen. She knows who she saw. And yet, as she stood there with these emotions going through her mind, the principal explained that Rudy Hernandez was a student that did attend that school a couple of years ago. He was set to graduate and go to Princeton on a full ride. However, shortly before he graduated, he was killed in a drive-by shooting. Now, Veronica, hearing this again, was best described as inconsolable. She had just narrowly avoided losing her life. She had seen a ghost, and then she was being told that the boy who had saved her life was in fact dead. And as Veronica was going through all of these things, the principal finished up the story about Rudy. The principal told her that he did in fact want to be a teacher. In fact, that's what he was going to school for. He tutored kids on the side, and overall, he was just a phenomenal person. Now, having heard all of this, Veronica believes that Rudy's spirit came back from beyond the grave to save her life. I want to know what you guys are thinking. Was she hallucinating? Maybe it was a guardian angel in the form of a student. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what you guys are thinking.